Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're following up on our research methods lecture, and today we're going to talk about a qualitative form of research. That's what we call ethnography, or simply put, just observations. Now, first and foremost, how many of you are people watchers? People watching is something that is always in common amongst sociology majors and certainly sociology professors. It's just innate, something that interests us. If you find yourself enjoying sitting in a McDonald's, having a cup of coffee, and watching other people live their lives, you might have a strong interest in sociology that you may not have been aware of. I've been a people watcher since I was a little kid. In fact, for me, people watching has been something that I've tried to understand how other people live their lives and why they make the decisions that they make. It interests me, and it's something that I think about on a daily basis with my job. We have a whole field that's interested in people watching, and there's not a number value to it, not a quantitative value, but we can get a qualitative value of those observations and the experiences that we learn about from doing so. There's an entire field for sociologists with PhDs often called ethnography. Ethnography means writing culture. It translates from graphos and ethnos. Ooh, that sounds like a good test question. Translates from graphos and ethnos, which means writing culture. For sociology majors, I like to think of it more simply as observation. Now, ethnography is a very important part of our discipline where you become engaged with a particular community, you observe them, you talk with them, you interview them, you eat with them, you stay at their homes, you share their food, and you truly get their experiences, even though you are not part of the community. One of the ethnographers that I worked with when I was in graduate school often told me that the people you study as an ethnographer are the experts. We go to the communities that we're studying because they are the experts on how they live their lives. We're the observers. Now, at an undergraduate level, you're not quite prepared to do a full-on ethnography, but you are 100% prepared to do a basic observation. Observations can be simple and sweet as watching a particular location and trying to understand how people use a particular space. For example, I've had students do observations where they sit and they watch how other people use the Daniel Boone statue here on our campus. You may have noted that boot is particularly shiny on that statue. It's over by the Keene Johnson building. Now, how many of you have touched the boot because it's good luck? In fact, that was something that a lot of my students wanted to understand is why did people touch the boot? What was the purpose for it? And when did they touch the boot? Was it something that they would rub Daniel Boone's boot early in the day because they felt that it was good luck? Or was it just a tradition, or why? So they actually did an observation to try and understand how people did this, when they did it, and maybe what it meant. This is a good example. The whole thing, however, is where we're understanding that as sociologists, we turn to the communities that we're studying for them to be the experts, because they are. That's something that I say a lot as an applied sociologist to the communities I'm working with. You're the experts. I'm the person who's here to study you and help understand what these things mean so that we can work together to find answers to your questions. So I always like to think about people watching as going to watch the experts, because they are the experts. How do we do these things? Well, they're really detailed. In fact, an ethnography is something that can take years. An ethnography that I did in graduate school took 6 months, and immense amount of hours, travel, interviews, and more, where we were talking to people to try and understand how and why they related to cemeteries in certain parts of West Virginia. And also, too, how maybe a community's slow passing was represented by lower interest in protecting cemeteries. That's above and beyond what an undergraduate student can really safely do. But observations are a little different. Again, this is something that you can set up to try and simply understand why people do certain things. Now, when it comes to the moment talking to people and asking them questions, that comes into an ethics issue, which I'll talk about in another slide just in a moment. But for the simple part of watching people, sociologists who are sociology majors can do that anytime. I do want to give you an example, though, of a really cool study that came out of the University of Tennessee. Now, I'm a graduate of the University of Tennessee with my PhD. And from East Tennessee as a whole. There was a guy named W.I. Thomas who was a really interesting researcher. And over 2 different years, 1918 and 1920, he studied the Polish communities in Chicago. Now, he was part at the time of what we call the Chicago School of Sociology. We'll talk about them a little later when we talk about urban sociology later in this semester. But they were a whole group of thinkers who were trying to understand how living in an urban area shaped your experiences in different ways, and also how we competed over resources in urban areas. For him, he was really interested in the immigrant communities coming from Poland to the United States. He wanted to understand what it meant to be an immigrant. How did you live your life differently as an immigrant? How did this impact your cultural norms and maybe the food that you eat? Were you now moving away from what would have been considered traditional cultural food to maybe what Americans were eating? How did you become part of being an American even as you're an immigrant? These are all questions that are very relevant even today. In fact, sociologists still are heavily interested in the idea of immigration, how it impacts the United States, and how it impacts people who move to the United States from other countries. Well, the thing was with W.I. Thomas, he was studying a community that he couldn't communicate with very well. It turns out that even though he was interested in studying the Polish community, he didn't speak anything even remotely near the Polish language. One of the other problems, too, is that in many immigrant communities, for many years, generations even, people probably won't begin to speak English. They may focus on the language that they've spent speaking the most of their life. They might learn some English so that they can get by, but their primary language will always be the language that they had when they first moved there. Now, later generations, sociologists have found, are very quick and apt to switch over to English because that's just kind of an expected norm for them. Also, they'll have looser ties to their culture sometimes as a result. But that's for another day in another class. In this case, W.I. Thomas was dealing with people who just didn't speak English. He struggled to understand how he might learn about the people that he wanted to study. In fact, he fretted over it. It was a really, really difficult scenario for him. And then one night, he heard tinkling outside of his door as someone rattled a trash can. And he figured out a very useful way in which he could study the people that interested him so much. That's right. He started digging through their trash cans. The moment you put your trash on the curb, it is public property, and they can now dig through your trash all you want. And in fact, that's exactly what he did. He started digging through trash cans to try and understand how this community was experiencing the United States. How did it change the things that they cast off and threw away? Maybe what kinds of newspapers or information would he find there? What kind of food items were they eating? What kind of things were they skipping over? What things were not present? It's exciting. In fact, in my in-person intro classes, I always like at this moment to go out and just get a trash can out of the hallway and bring it into the classroom and find out what we would find in there. What might we find out about EKU students by digging through a trash can in the building? What would we find in there? Well, I'll tell you the usual things that we find in there. First off, I find lots of fast food wrappers, things from Starbucks, things from McDonald's, maybe pizza boxes. I find all sorts of convenience food wrappers too, things like Cliff Bars, snack bars, candy bars, and so forth. What does that say about a college student? Well, thinking qualitatively as a sociologist, we would point out that college students have a shortage of time, and one of the ways in which they compensate for that is using fast food. In fact, you're going to be probably living off fast food for the next 4 years for the bulk of your nutrition. And it's not very nutritious, I'm sorry to say, but it's part of the experience. Now, what else do we find? Well, we often find the things that you cast off from your class. Broken pencils, broken pens, old notebooks. I've occasionally found textbooks in classes when I've pulled in trash cans because people have just decided they're done with a class and they threw away the book. These are all examples of things that you use, things that we call material culture. We'll talk about those in a later lecture. So these are all things that you cast off as part of your daily experience. As a result, I can learn a lot about students. I don't actually have to talk to any of them. I can understand through the data that they've given me in their trash quite a bit of information. So too did W.I. Thomas in his study of trash cans. It was a very exciting experience. Sociologists do all sorts of other kinds of studies. We do the surveys, we do ethnographies. We've briefly mentioned an observation as a more simplified version of an ethnography. We do interviews where we ask people how they feel about things. We do experiments where we try to see how maybe changing a variable might shape how someone feels. We also do a lot of secondary data analysis. That's where we use other people's data to try to learn more about our society. Content analysis is a really exciting qualitative approach where we try to understand how and why people say certain things. We look for themes, we look for ideas that are common in everything from Twitter comments to Facebook posts, even down to memes, why they exist, what do they do, what purpose do they serve. We also do a lot of longitudinal studies where we look at the same ideas over time. For example, right now I'm doing some follow-up studies where I'm seeing how things have changed since the first time I studied a particular phenomenon in society. Now, occasionally with ethnography, I want to point out a special thing that happens, and it's something that'll also approach having a conversation about ethics. With sociologists, we do work with people, and we recognize that people have a certain level of protection that's coming to them to make sure that they aren't harmed in our studies. That's very important to sociologists. There are times in which sociologists will be deceptive about who they are to conduct certain kinds of studies. For example, I have colleagues who have studied extremist groups. They have studied isolated groups that you or I could not easily get access to being a member, and they wouldn't also necessarily allow someone to watch them and observe and write about their activities. There have been cases, and this is always PhD level stuff. This is not something that an undergrad would ever do, where we aren't entirely forthcoming about who we are in a particular study. This is to make sure that we don't change how that community might act. For example, if maybe a certain community, such as a very remote religious community, for example, if they knew a PhD sociologist was watching and taking notes about their behaviors, would they change their behaviors? And so in that case, we occasionally have studies where we don't come straight out and say, hey, we are a sociologist, we're here to study you. The whole thing is we're trying to make sure we don't change how people act so that we can truly document society. Now, there is an issue of trust here because sociologists always make clear that when the study is completed to some degree, they need to be able to debrief the people who were involved so that they understand how the data are being used, how they were represented. In fact, with many ethnographies that are in books, you'll see that the latter part of the book often talks about this debriefing process of how people involved were notified, their reactions, how they felt about the use of the data, and more. There's also an element of risk to it as well. Sometimes not being entirely forthcoming about who you are can be a way to protect yourself. For example, the research that I've done in West Virginia on cemeteries required me to not necessarily be forthcoming about being a sociologist because I was concerned, A, that it might endanger my safety because of where I was conducting the studies. And B, I was afraid that it would change how people would talk to me about protecting cemeteries. So again, sometimes ethnography is a necessity for studies, but it is very rare, and it's very uncommon, and it's always something reserved for PhD sociologists. Throughout all kinds of research, sociologists are thinking about ethics. We're working with human beings. It's not like we're working with daffodils and we're dividing daffodil bulbs to see how they work. We're working with human beings. We're working with people who live lives long after they're part of our studies. We have to make sure, without any doubt, that we don't cause harm to the people involved in our studies. We have to make sure that we respect their individual rights to not be harmed by participating in our studies. We can't force them to participate in our studies. Moreover, we have a social responsibility to make sure that we, in studying society, do so ethically. This was something that Auguste Comte and later Emile Durkheim really felt very strongly about. Now, for every study that I, as a PhD sociologist, do, and for my graduate and undergraduate students, we do the same thing. We review our study. We say how we're going to do it. We say what we're going to measure, what population and sample we're looking at. We talk about how we're going to conceptualize and operationalize concepts. We go through the whole process, and then we submit this as an application to an institutional review board, or simply IRB, that's located here at EKU. And it's really exciting because these are peers here at EKU who know how research works and have been trained in making sure that research is ethical and that people involved won't be harmed. They then review the report. They provide suggestions if anything needs to be changed to make sure the study is protected and that people involved are protected. And then they can approve or deny that study beginning. and I can't pursue any research that hasn't been approved by my IRB. I have to make sure that I follow the rules on that. It's very important. We have to make sure that we don't cause harm. So this IRB board is a very important part of the university experience for researchers, both student and otherwise. Now, throughout, sociologists do a lot of research, and our research is very valuable. We are a highly methodological field that adheres to the scientific method. We ask a lot of questions because there's a lot of questions to ask. Remember, the paradox of sociology is that every time we answer one question, we've created more. Likewise, sociologists are a very interesting bunch in that you have some that consider themselves quantitative researchers and others that consider themselves qualitative researchers. There's also some cases where we blend those two methods together. In fact, the bulk of my studies include mostly quantitative, but there's always a little qualitative that sneaks in there. We love surveys. We are pros at building surveys, but our most pronounced strength is that we are people watchers. We enjoy watching people and trying to understand their motivations, why they choose to do certain things, and why they choose to not do other things. But more importantly, throughout, we want to make sure that we are ethical and that no one would ever be harmed by participating in one of our studies, whether they realize they are or aren't. Now, that leaves us off for the end of our methods lecture. That also completes all of our material for our first section of lecture material. So we now have lectures 1 through 4 completed. You'll want to make sure by the due date on Blackboard that you've completed reading all of your readings, that you have make sure that you've completed your lectures, and that you've completed all the quizzes. Also, depending on the semester, there may be a critical reading assignment that's now available for you to check out. So make sure that you complete all those things by the due dates. Now, if you have questions, feel free to contact me. If you're not sure how something operates or don't know what something means, I'm always happy to answer questions. More importantly, don't forget, I've got open office hours available to you. Information for that is on Blackboard. I'm always happy to meet with you and chat about these lectures. If you got questions, if you need anything, you know where to find me. When we pick up in our next lecture series for our second lecture series, we'll start talking about culture and cultural sociology, one of those very exciting fields that help us understand in some small way the things happening around us, our culture, and how that can shape our individual experiences. I look forward to seeing you there. Take care.